The son of an insurance agent, George Joseph Smith was born in Bethnal Green, London. He was sent to a reformatory at Gravesend, Kent, at the age of 9, and later served time for swindling and theft. In 1896, Smith was imprisoned for 12 months for persuading a woman to steal from her employers. He used the proceeds to open a baker's shop in Leicester. In 1898, under the alias Oliver George Love, Smith married Carolyn Thornhill in Leicester. It was his only legal marriage, although he also married another woman bigamously the following year. George and Carolyn moved to London, where she worked as a maid for a number of employers, stealing from them for her husband. Thornhill was eventually caught in Worthing, Sussex, and sentenced to 12 months. On her release, she incriminated her husband, and he was imprisoned in January 1901 for 2 years. Upon his release, Carolyn fled to Canada. Smith then went back to his other wife, cleared out her savings, and left. In June 1908, Smith married Florence Wilson, a widow from Worthing. On July 3rd, he left her, but not before taking £30, equivalent to £3,000 in 2019, drawn from her savings account and selling her belongings from their Camden residence in London. On July 30th in Bristol, Smith then married Edith Peglar, who had replied to an advertisement for a housekeeper position. He would disappear for months at a time, saying that he was going to another city to ply his trade, which he claimed was selling antiques. In between his other marriages, Smith would always come back to Peglar with money. In October 1909, Smith married Sarah Freeman under the name of George Rose Smith. As with Wilson, he left her after clearing out her savings and selling her war bonds, with a total take of £400. He then married Beatrice Mundy, and then Alice Burnham, and in September 1914 he married Alice Reed under the alias George Oliver James. In total, Smith entered into 7 bigamous marriages between 1908 and 1914. In most of these cases, Smith went through his wife's possessions before he disappeared. In January 1915, Detective Inspector Arthur Neal received a letter from a Joseph Crossley, who owned a boarding house in Blackpool, Lancashire. Included with the letter were 2 newspaper clippings. One was from the News of the World about the death of Margaret Lloyd, who died in her lodgings in London. She was found in her bathtub by her husband John Lloyd. The other clipping contained the report of a coroner's inquest in Blackpool. It was about a woman named Alice Smith, who died suddenly in a boarding house while in her bathtub. She was found by her husband George Smith. Alice was not an heiress, but had worked hard and saved money. Additionally, George Smith had taken out a life insurance policy on his wife worth £500, equivalent to £50,000 in 2019. The letter, dated January 3rd, was written by Crossley, the landlord of Mr. and Mrs. Smith. Although he didn't know George Smith and John Lloyd were the same man, his letter was based on his suspicion concerning the striking similarity of the 2 incidents, and he urged the police to investigate the matter. So on December 17, 1913, Detective Neal went to Bismarck Road, where the Lloyds had taken lodgings. He found it hard to believe that an adult like Margaret Lloyd could have drowned in such a small tub. He then interviewed the coroner, Dr. Bates, who had signed the death certificate, and asked if there were signs of violence on the woman. There were none except for a tiny bruise above the left elbow. Upon further investigation, Detective Neal learned that a will had been made on the 18th, just 3 hours before Margaret died, and the sole beneficiary was her husband, who had submitted the will to a lawyer for settlement. In addition, she had withdrawn all her savings on that same day. On January 12th, Coroner Dr. Bates called Detective Neal with an inquiry from the Yorkshire Insurance Company regarding the death of Mrs. Lloyd. 3 days before she was married, she had taken out a life insurance policy for £700, equivalent to £70,000 in 2019, with her husband John as sole beneficiary. Similarly, the late Mrs. Alice Smith had earlier taken out a life insurance policy and made a will in her husband's favor. Detective Neal asked the coroner to issue a favorable report to the insurance company. He was counting on the suspect to get in touch with his lawyer, and therefore the office was watched day and night. On February 1st, a man fitting John Lloyd's / George Smith's description appeared. Detective Neal introduced himself and asked him whether he was John Lloyd. After Lloyd answered in the affirmative, Neal then asked him whether he was also George Smith. The man denied it vehemently, but Detective Neal, already sure that Lloyd and Smith were the same man, told him that he would take him for questioning on suspicion of bigamy. The man finally admitted that he was indeed Smith and was arrested. When Smith was arrested for the charge of bigamy and suspicion of murder, the pathologist Bernard Spilsbury was asked to determine how the women died. Although he was the home office pathologist and acted mainly in a consulting capacity, he was also available for direct assistance to the police force. Margaret Lloyd's body was exhumed, and Spilsbury's first task was to confirm drowning as the cause of death, and if so, whether by accident or by force. He confirmed the tiny bruise on the elbow as noted before, as well as 2 microscopic marks. There were no signs of heart or circulatory disease, but the evidence suggested that the death was almost instantaneous, as if the victim died of a sudden stroke. Poison was also seen as a possibility, and Spilsbury ordered tests on its presence. Finally, he proposed to Detective Neal that they run some experiments in the very same bathtub in which Mrs. Lloyd died. Meanwhile, newspaper reports about the brides in the baths began to appear. On February 8th, the chief police officer of Herne Bay, a small seaside resort in Kent, had read the stories and sent Detective Neal a report of yet another death, which was strikingly similar to the other 2. A year before Alice's death in Blackpool, one Henry Williams had rented a house with no bath in 80 High Street for himself and his wife, Beatrice Mundy, whom he had married in 1910. He then rented a bathtub 7 weeks later. Soon after, he took his wife to a general practitioner, Dr. Frank French, due to a supposed epileptic fit, although she was only complaining of headaches, for which the doctor prescribed some medication. On July 12, 1912, Williams woke Dr. French, saying that his wife was having another fit. He checked on her and promised to come back the following afternoon. However, he was surprised when, on the following morning, he was informed by Williams that his wife had died of drowning. The doctor found Beatrice in the tub, her head under water, her legs stretched out straight, and her feet protruding out of the water. There was no trace of violence, so French attributed the drowning to epilepsy. The inquest jury awarded her husband, Henry Williams, the amount of £2,579, equivalent to £257,000 in 2019, as stipulated in Mrs. Williams' will, which was made up just 5 days before her death. After learning of this story, which was eerily similar to the others, Detective Neal then sent photographs of George Smith to Herne Bay for possible identification. Soon after, he received confirmation that indeed Henry Williams, John Lloyd, and George Smith were all the same man. Back in London, Spilsbury, the pathologist, was conducting an autopsy of Alice Smith. The results were the same as with Margaret Lloyd. There was a lack of violence, every suggestion of instantaneous death, and little evidence of actual drowning. Furthermore, there were no traces of poison on Margaret Lloyd. Baffled, Spilsbury took measurements of the corpse and had the bathtub sent to London. For weeks, Spilsbury pondered over the bathtubs and the victim's measurements. The first stage of an epileptic fit consists of a stiffening and extension of the entire body. Considering Beatrice Williams' height, 5 feet 7 inches, and the length of the tub, 5 feet, the upper part of her body would have been pushed to the sloping head of the tub, far above the level of the water. The second stage of an epileptic fit consists of violent spasms of the limbs, which were drawn up to the body and then flung outward. Therefore, no one her size could possibly get underwater even when her muscles were relaxed. In the third stage, this tub was simply too small for it to be possible, ruling out the possibility that Beatrice drowned in the bathtub while experiencing an epileptic fit. Using Dr. French's description of Beatrice Williams when he found her in the bathtub, Spilsbury reasoned that George Smith must have seized her by the feet and suddenly pulled them upward toward himself, sliding the upper part of her body underwater. The sudden flood of water into her nose and throat might cause shock and sudden loss of consciousness, explaining the absence of injuries and minimal signs of drowning. So Detective Neal hired several experienced female divers of the same size and build as the victims. He tried to push them underwater by force, but there would be inevitable signs of struggle. Neal then unexpectedly pulled the feet of one of the divers, and her head glided underwater before she knew what happened. Suddenly, Neal saw that the woman was no longer moving. He quickly pulled her out of the tub, and it took him and a doctor over half an hour to revive her. When she came to, she related that the only thing she remembered was the rush of water before she lost consciousness. Thus, Spilsbury's theory was confirmed. George Joseph Smith was arrested February 15, 1915, and formally charged for the murders of Beatrice Williams, Alice Smith, and Margaret Lloyd on March 23, 1915. On June 22, the trial began at the Old Bailey. Although he could only be tried for the murder of Beatrice Mundy in accordance with English law, the prosecution used the deaths of the other 2 women to establish the pattern of Smith's crimes. This was allowed by Mr. Justice Scrutton, despite the protests of Smith's counsel. Smith himself elected not to give evidence in his own defense, indicating this to his counsel in a handwritten note. It took the jury about 20 minutes on July 1st to find him guilty. He was then sentenced to death. Smith's counsel appealed, but it was dismissed, and George Smith was hanged in Maidstone Prison on August 13th by hangman John Ellis. It isn't known for certain if George Smith had more victims other than his 3 wives, but thanks to a suspicious landlord, a relentless detective, and a dedicated pathologist, George Smith's reign of terror finally came to an end.